Ladies and gentlemen, and friends of Yonsei University, and friends of who are working together to make this world a better place. Thank you for joining us at the GEEF for All special seminar today, organized by Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea. This seminar is being broadcast online, streaming via Zoom. I'm Professor Song In-han, Vice President for Student Affairs, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Ban Ki-moon Center for International Cooperation at Yonsei University. 네, 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 저희 GEEF for All이라는 이름으로 진행되는 스페셜 세미나에 함께해 주신 여러분들 너무 반갑고, 특히 더 좋은 세상을 만드는 여러분들 다시 한번 환영합니다. 저는 오늘 서열을 맡은 연세대학교 학생복지처장 송인한이고, 또 반기문 국제협력센터장을 맡고 있습니다. I know that most of participants can understand Korean. However, please understand that we will proceed this seminar in English so that we can make 윤선이 소장님's talk as a global educational material. As soon as possible, we will upload it on YouTube with Korean subtitles. Yonsei University established the Institute for Global Engagement and Empowerment, or IGEE, 글로벌사회공헌원, in 2017 to globally promote sustainable development goals. IGEE was established with our founding honorary director, 8th United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and since then we have organized the annual Global Engagement and Empowerment Forum on Sustainable Development, or GEEF, a world major conference in which we strive to accomplish the UN SDGs. In addition to the annual GEEF conference, we have hosted a seminar series on the most urgent SDG issues, which we've named GEEF for All special seminar. So far, we have covered the following topics: peace and human rights in Myanmar, ESG of the semiconductor industry, and so on. And the recent GEEF for All seminars were about world peace and climate action, featuring Colombian President Ivan Duque and Ban Ki-moon, and about ESG with Kim Jong-il 교수님 of Rich-American Asia Pacific University in Japan. 연세대학교는 2017년도에 반기문 전 유엔 사무총장님과 함께 글로벌 사회공헌원을 조직해서 전 세계적인 유엔의 지속가능 발전 목표를 달성하기 위해서 노력해 왔습니다. 그 결과 중에 하나로 2018년부터 GEEF라는 SDG 관련된 가장 주요한, 전 세계적으로 주요한 컨퍼런스를 계속해 왔습니다. 매년 진행되는 GEEF 이후에도 저희는 GEEF for All이라는 스페셜 시리즈로 가장 어전트한 이슈에 대한 세미나를 계속해 왔습니다. 최근에는 미얀마 사태에 대한 미얀마 평화와 휴먼 라이츠에 대한 세미나도 했었고요. 또 반도체 산업에서의 ESG에 대한, 또 클라이밋 액션에 대해서, 또 최근에는 ESG와 기업의 사회적 책임에 대해서 계속 진행을 해온 바 있습니다. SDG number 2 is zero hunger, and the UN World Food Program has been working to achieve this goal. Food insecurity has become a more critical issue, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. 잘 아시다시피 SDG 넘버 2로서 기아를 종식시키는 목표를 우리는 가지고 있고요. 오늘 모실 윤선이 소장님이 이끌고 계신 UN WFP는 특히 이런 넘버 2를 달성하기 위해서 최선의 노력을 해오고 계십니다. 최근 들어서 특히 코비드-19 팬데믹과 러시아의 우크라이나 침공 이후에 식량 안보 문제는 매우 중요해지고 있습니다. Today, Director Yonsei 소장님 of the UN World Food Program is here with us. She is the most authoritative expert to talk about today's topic. Director Yoon is currently serving as the director of the World Food Program, Seoul Global Office since July 2021. She joined the WFP as a South Korea Junior Professional Officer in 2003 and have worked in many positions at WFP, including the Deputy Country Director in the Kingdom of Lesotho and Senior Policy Officer at the headquarters. Before joining WFP, she worked with McKinsey & Company's Seoul office from 1999 to 2002. She holds a bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of the Witwatersrand. Did I pronounce right? Okay. Yeah. University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm so happy to have Yonsei 소장님 here at the GEEF for All seminar. And today's title is Global Food Insecurity and Insight from WFP. Please welcome Director Yonsei 소장님.
I have chosen, like Professor Son has said, that to undertake this lecture in English. It is simply for more accuracy and because I'm more comfortable with doing it in English. So I beg your kind understanding. And I'd like to just start by really expressing my deep gratitude to the Institute for Global Engagement and Empowerment, to Professor Son, and for this opportunity to be part of what is a very important series of conversations that G4All has actually signified and continues to represent. The World Food Program is delighted to be a part of that voice, and we hope that in the future there will also be more opportunities for us to continue contributing to that ongoing dialogue. And I hope that's where I will also get to see a lot of you again, both here in the room and joining us online. I've prepared about an hour, maybe 50 minutes of lecture, a presentation, really just to go over very quickly these 5 broad contents. Many of you may know the World Food Program, but there may be some of you who don't know the World Food Program very well. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of what WFP is, what we do, how we do it. Because there's a lot of things about WFP that a lot of people are not necessarily aware of, but I think it's important to know that. Secondly, like it was introduced, currently we know that the world is going through massive inflation. We're dealing with a crisis at a global scale, and this has been exacerbated by the Ukraine crisis. And therefore, it's an opportunity for me to share with you a status of what the global food insecurity situation is like, what WFP is seeing, what data we are analyzing, and why we're very worried. I wanted to also then speak a little bit about WFP's resilience programming. And you may wonder, why suddenly is it about resilience programming? I think that will become a little bit clearer as I move into my presentation. But suffice to say that resilience is central to ending hunger. And that is what SDG 2 is about. After that, I wanted to just mention to you a few, an opportunity to share with you some of the innovative approaches that the World Food Program is doing, not just designing, but we're actually trying it out in the field. And then last but not least, all of us, at least in this room, are Korean. I'm sure a large part of those who have joined us online are also Korean. I think that there is quite a lot that we can learn and know about the country that we come from, its history, and the little role that WFP also played a long time ago, before Korea became what it is today, one of the top most developed countries in the world. So, WFP. I don't want to sound like I'm bragging, but WFP is the biggest humanitarian organization in the world. It is the biggest both in terms of size of its staff, the breadth of its programs, the amount of revenue that our programs require. In many, many ways, it is the largest humanitarian organization. We have presence in 123 countries. We have our headquarters in Rome. And there are two other UN agencies who have headquarters in Rome. One is the Food and Agriculture Organization, and then the other one is International Fund for Agriculture Development, IFAD. And the three UN agencies, commonly called the Rome-based agencies, are all three agencies that are working in the field of food security and agriculture. We have more than 21,000 staff all over the world. Most of them have been recruited locally, and most of them, in fact, 90% of them are actually in the field, not in headquarters, in the field. We work not by ourselves, we work with NGO partners. We have about 1,700 partners, and the way we operate, we survive on voluntary funded donation. We are a voluntary funded organization. We rely on the generosity of donor governments and donor companies and individuals in order to do what we do. World Food Programme is one of many UN agencies, and we are part of what we call the UN system. And the way the UN system works, especially when you're working with different partners who are not necessarily the UN, and working often in difficult circumstances, is that we take on a cluster approach. This is just a different way of saying that we organize ourselves based on different clusters where an agency will take the lead, but on behalf of all the other agencies that are active in that cluster. So when you look at the different clusters, there's several, there's many different clusters. I think there are 11. WFP is active in the sector of food security. So global food security, we are the co-leads with FAO. And this means that anything related to food security, as a cluster, we are one of the co-lead agencies. So if we're doing food assessments on the ground, this is an area that WFP would lead, but also take others with us. We are also the lead agency for logistics. This means that WFP uses its logistics capabilities and its network of boats and planes and trucks, warehouses, supply chain know-how, procurement, all of these things, not just to help our programs, but also to help other agencies do what they need to do in emergency situations. So for instance, in Ukraine, there is a warehouse in Poland that WFP is operating, but that warehouse does not contain any of our food. It contains all the non-food items of NGO partners who have these commodities waiting to go into Ukraine, and WFP is managing that service, that logistics service, by operating this warehouse basically on behalf of the logistics cluster. Last but not least, very strange, World Food Programme is the lead in emergency telecommunications. Why? Because when there is an earthquake or a volcanic eruption or a hurricane, the first thing that you will notice is infrastructure damage. And part of infrastructure damage will affect connectivity, our ability to talk to each other, to communicate with each other, to have mobile networks, etc. So in contexts like that, WFP has a team based in Dubai, and they are called the fittest. It stands for something. I can't tell you what it stands for, but that team is dedicated to going into these disaster zones and doing what they need to do to set up satellite connectivity so that NGOs can start operating and responding to the situation on the ground. So this is the third area that WFP, the World Food Programme, is the lead the lead cluster, the cluster lead in. We talk about mandates a lot. The UN, is divided up in a way that we focus on our mandate, which allows them not to overlap and do the same thing that some other agency is doing, because it's a waste of resource and it's inefficient. And by making sure that we have clear mandates, we're not going to be overlapping with any other agency. In the case of WFP, we have a dual mandate. The first mandate is saving lives. And that, by virtue of those two words, saving lives, you can tell that this is a mandate about responding to a humanitarian situation. So we go in, we find the people who don't have enough to eat, who will face some kind of a massive catastrophe without help, and we save their lives, literally, by providing them food assistance. We're usually arriving on the scene within 72 hours, and it is this emergency response mandate that allows us to have the world-class logistics capacity that makes us the cluster lead, that allows us the opportunity to provide emergency telecommunication services. It is the context where we find ourselves that allows us as an organization to step up and provide these services on behalf of others as well. The second mandate, I'm sorry about the formatting. The second mandate is changing lives. So imagine I'm saving lives, and I've saved this life, and then next year I have to save the same life, and then again the same life. Every year I'm saving the same life. Unless I'm doing something about making that life better, I'm going to be saving the same life over and over and over. So the Changing Lives agenda is what we call our development mandate. The goal that we have to actually make what we do contribute in a sustainable, impactful way towards the self-sufficiency and resilience of individuals and communities who are otherwise vulnerable. Okay? So you've all heard the, don't give the fish, rather teach how to fish, that analogy. That is basically, in a nutshell, what our dual mandate is about. This is a series around SDGs, so I have to tell you that our organization's vision is really focused around SDG 2, Zero Hunger, and SDG 17. This concept that everyone and everything is interlinked, and that we cannot do anything. Not one entity or one country can solve any of the SDGs on their own. So these two goals make up what is our strategic plan, and our strategic outcome is to achieve zero hunger, not on our own, but working through our partners, to provide urgent food and nutrition needs, giving people better nutrition, as well as health and education outcomes, and improving and creating sustainable livelihoods. Yeah, so it's got the emergency and the development component in there. The second outcome is to build and transform systems. This is where we look for outcomes that strengthen national systems, where actors working in humanitarian, development, and peace nexus are more effective and efficient, because we're looking at the continuum of activities and assistance, not just in emergency, not just in development, but across this whole continuum. And so this is where we talk a little bit about having a more systems approach, not doing things on our own and not providing assistance on our own, but looking at providing assistance through systems that can be strengthened and sustained even after we leave. Okay? SDG 2 for WFP, we have these 4 targets under SDG 2, access to food. This means that if someone does not have, if someone is not able to have enough food to eat in order to survive, then we need to help them get access. And that's usually a case in emergency situations, when there is war, when there is a disaster, and people are, for whatever reason, unable to access the food that they need to survive. That is when we come in and provide the food assistance. Ending malnutrition. Malnutrition exists in many, many different forms, and it's a life cycle. It starts with before you're born, all the way to to when you die. So it's a whole. It's a phenomenon that affects you throughout your life cycle, and there are things that we need to do across different age groups in order to ensure that people are not just having enough to eat, they're having the right kinds of quality food and the minerals and supplements that allow them to have healthy lives. Smallholder farmers, productivity and income. You know, in the world, when you talk about food insecure people, the vast majority of them are going to be smallholder farmers. So this is a special category of people who we, WFP, serves, because not only are they one of the mostly affected when it comes to food insecurity, they also are potentially the population group that can actually solve the issues around production, because it's smallholder farmers that, globally speaking, produce the most food. So they are both, they may be the recipients of assistance today, but they themselves have the potential to become the solution. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, this systems approach, creating sustainable food systems, knowing that it is not just about doing one thing or another, but making sure that the whole value chain is being strengthened and coordinated so that the whole system is benefiting not just one segment of the value chain. And then under SDG 12, we've got capacity building, something that we all know is so important. You don't do, you do and teach. Policy coherence, making sure that everything that we do is aligned, that there is a coherence across the kind of the lofty objectives that we're trying to achieve, and together. This requires, especially during times of need, this requires diversified resources. We cannot just look at one donor or 5 donors or 10 donors. We can't just rely on the same donors to give more and more and more. We need to actually diversify and engage more sectors and more in order to tap into more diverse resources in order to meet what is increasing needs. And then there is a global partnership. I mean, I think it's quite self-explanatory that when you talk about partnership, it really is looking at the globe as as a network of partners doing things together, and this is why coordination is so important. So just a few examples of our saving lives, which means meeting immediate needs. We've got emergency relief. So emergency, you go and respond, you give assistance. You also make sure that you're prepared in case there's a next one. So for instance, there's a typhoon or a cyclone. You're assisting, but there may be another typhoon next week. So you want to also make sure that you're doing some preparedness at the same time. When we give food assistance, it's not just a matter of distributing bags of flour or rice or oil or sugar. Sometimes it is a matter of giving the beneficiaries cash or ATM cards and saying, go and buy what you need to buy and buy it from your local shops so that it helps sustain the local economy, rather than me buying from Argentina using ships and airplanes to fly thousands and thousands of kilometers to then distribute it in South Sudan. I'm just using these as an example. Supply chain, the logistics service that WFP provides, it's not just for cargo, it's also for people. So if there is a war in Ukraine and there are no airlines flying, but there are people who need us, our help, and we need to get our stuff in, we operate an airline. It's called the Humanitarian Air Service. WFP operates that, and it's not just for us, it's for the entire humanitarian community. And we will fly people in to where they need to be. And then there is obviously the monitoring of any threat and disaster risk reduction. It's a little bit like preparedness, but this is something that is more than that. It really is about analyzing and taking steps to mitigate and reduce risks in general. Changing lives, and here's where the reference to resilience comes in. This is about investing in resilience, people's ability to resist, to sustain, to overcome. So some of the programs that fall under our Changing Lives agenda could be nutrition, so nutrition sensitive, nutrition specific programs. We've got school feeding. I think this is a very common program. We all know about it in Korea. But in some of the countries where we work, school feeding, especially homegrown school feeding, has the potential to allow a kid to come to school, get a nourishing meal, and as the result of that meal, he or she has access to education that otherwise their family would not be able to give. So it's killing two birds with one stone. Not only that, when there is a homegrown element to it, the food that is used in that school feeding program could be sourced locally by the community, by the same smallholder farmers I was talking to you about earlier, and thereby it is using the school feeding program as a demand, as a market to build up local livelihoods. And this is one of our flagship programs. We've got food and cash assistance for assets, so we don't just give free assistance. We actually say, hey, community, let's figure out together what you guys need as a community, whether it is, like this picture, a communal garden where you can grow vegetables and then sell it and then distribute, share the profit. Or maybe you want to create a road or fix a school or whatever. As a community, you do that, and WFP will assist those people through what used to be called food for work. And in this case, it can be food, it can be cash. But we will help the people who are food insecure, not people who are food secure, but we will only assist the people who are food insecure to do these activities and get ultimately paid for it. Capacity strengthening systems are also activity programs that are in our longer term trajectory, and then there is digital innovation. Everything that we do in today's age has to be thought of through a digital, technological, innovative lens. So we will go a little bit deeper into that towards the end of my presentation. So we spoke a little bit about Ukraine and what the world the global food security looks like right now. And we've got 7-8 years until 2030. We know that the SDGs are supposed to be reached by then in a few years. But right now, at least for SDG 2, it doesn't look like that's going to be possible. In fact, it's going the other way around. It's getting worse. If you look at this map of the world and you imagine it to be a globe, there is literally a circle of fire around the whole world, like around the planet. And it goes from West Africa, the Sahel region, you can see the Sahel region, it's red. You go further down, this is this area, this is Uganda, this is East Africa, the Horn of Africa, going through a very, very bad drought right now. this area has consecutive droughts. The number of people who are at the doorstep of famine becomes millions. It's very quick for the numbers to become very bad in this area. You've also got parts of southern Africa here that really, from climate change, cyclones, unusual weather patterns, it's really, this is an area that historically in southern Africa has not really had this level of food insecurity. But you can see that this is, I mean, look at Africa. You keep going up, you've got Afghanistan, you've got Yemen, you've got Pakistan, you've got Ukraine up there, you've got parts of Asia, you've heard about what's happening in Sri Lanka. Keep going, and then you come down to the Latin American and Caribbean area, and not only is there things like consecutive drought, so climatic issues, you've also got rising insecurity, criminality. Look at Haiti. So you've got this convergence of different factors that are creating what is this perfect storm of food insecurity that is literally everywhere. It's popping up everywhere. So before the pandemic started, we know that the number of people pre-pandemic was about 135 million. This is the people that WFP assists. And we assist only those who are the most food insecure in the world. So out of 811 million people who are hungry, 2 years ago, our plan was to help 135 million. After COVID, that number became 276 million. Now, with the Ukraine crisis, and since the prices started rocketing up in February and then again in March, and and we're talking prices of food, fuel, you're talking about shortages in supply chain, all of this is having a real knock-on effect. And this number is now 325. We've got an additional 50 million people. But actually, every couple of weeks, that number is changing. There was a report that came out yesterday, and that number was 345 million. So this slide, in just a few days, is already outdated. I'm not trying to scare you, but really, in 2-3 years, the numbers are almost tripling, and this is a really big concern. Let's just talk about perhaps the reason why. I mean, we know that Ukraine, there's a war in Ukraine, but why is that having an impact in food insecurity in Africa? Well, it's because that Ukraine and Russia were the breadbasket, right? That's where most of the wheat, so much of the agriculture, international wheat and maize was provided by from these two countries, and that's just a few of many other commodities that they are key players in. And so the shortages are having this knock-on effect because most of the countries where we work have to import food, these types of food. And when they're not available, or countries are shutting their borders, this is raising prices, and these countries just can't afford it. So then what happens? In countries, like Sri Lanka, where there's, 80% inflation, or even triple number inflations actually, where these increases are happening like weekly, this creates not only an upheaval in global food and energy markets, but it causes tension, it causes insecurity, it causes people to protest because they do not have enough to eat, and they cannot access the basics that they need to access in order to survive. This is also just another demonstration of how the wheat export has changed over the years. So I mean, I don't need to go through all of this, but all to say that the expected shortfall, the speculation is also having this knock-on effect. And so prices have been on the rise since mid-2020s. Actually, it's not like it suddenly started rising, but but the rate with which it's increased and the level of the increase is unprecedented since February, and then again a new record in March. And perhaps most of you are not old enough, but I recall 2008 and 2011 when there was the last global food price crises, and in 2011 the Arab Springs, where all these countries had this major social upheaval in demonstration of the fact that these prices were leading to them being unable to afford what they needed to afford in order to have 3 meals a day. And I need to remind you, it's not just about agriculture commodities, it's about what allows agriculture to function. So fuel, right? And in the case of Ukraine and Russia, fertilizers, they produce massive amount of fertilizers for the rest of the world. So not only is the war impacting Ukraine's own ability to plant and harvest for next year, it is impacting the ability of so many other countries who are not able to access the fertilizer and the inputs that they normally would need to get and would normally source from these countries. So you can see that based on this list, it just gives you a snapshot of some of those countries that are import dependent on Russia, on Ukraine. And these are countries that are in they're Middle Eastern countries. There's some of them are in Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa. Some are in South Asia. You know, it's affecting not just, you know, the poor countries or countries in Africa. It's affecting across the board. And so we are feeling it here too, right? In Korea, we're feeling it here too. And so basically, the worry is that this kind of trend, which isn't going to go away anytime soon, is going to create a social upheaval, like what we're already seeing in some countries like Sri Lanka, what we saw at a massive scale in 2011, and something that really concerns us, because the moment that happens, you know, it's a completely different situation. One that is very insecure, one that is, you know, difficult to resolve. So, in short, what can we call this? We can call this something, you know, like a triple jeopardy. I don't know if you've all heard that terminology before, triple jeopardy. Basically, right now, the number of acutely hungry people in the world, so acutely means, you know, very badly hungry, is rising, okay? Not only that, the funding, the resources that we need in order to meet this humanitarian need is growing, but the needs are, so the funding is growing, people are being generous, governments are being generous, South Korea is being generous, but the needs are outpacing. So the funding might be increasing, but the needs are increasing even more. And so this gap is not getting smaller, it's actually getting bigger. And it's a difficult one to speak about, because people are, you know, our donors are giving more, but it's just not enough. And actually the gap is getting bigger than it was, you know, this time last year. And not only that, the high prices are not only affecting our beneficiaries, it's affecting us too. So in order to ship the same amount of food, to buy and ship the same amount of food, and save or assist the same amount of people between now versus earlier this year, it's costing, just to do exactly the same thing, it's costing us more than $70 million more per month. I want to say that again. Every month, in order to do exactly the same thing that we were doing a few months ago, we need $71 million more per month, every month. And that's because of the cost of the actual food, but it's also the cost of fuel and supply chain. How do you sustain this? So, as the world is facing a year of unprecedented humanitarian needs in 2022, we have to remember the two mandates that I mentioned earlier on, the saving lives and the changing lives, and work on both fronts. Because it's easy to say it's an emergency, you know, we have to respond, and we have to respond by reaching as many people with the minimal amount of assistance because it's life-saving. But if we keep doing that and ignoring the other changing lives agenda because it's hard or because it's not, you know, it's an emergency, we have to prioritize, we will never end hunger. It's as simple as that. And so, so we're reminded that in an emergency, the first thing to go are things like nutrition, education, you know. But actually, in the emergency context, those things are even more important to keep integrated rather than give them up in order to just pursue the emergency response. Also, when it comes to conflict, conflict is the #1 driver of hunger. Did you guys know that? It's conflict that creates the most hunger in the world. And conflict is preventing millions of families from accessing food. And we know that conflict also produces hunger, right? But we also know that hunger, and I mentioned the 2011 Arab Spring, hunger can create conflict. So it is both a cause and a result of conflict. And so if left unattended, it can create a vicious cycle that deepens hunger more and more and more. And for this, I reflect on the fact that in 2020, the World Food Programme was humbled by the Nobel Peace Prize Award. It's particularly because of the recognition that food, in the words of my executive director, food is the pathway to peace and stability. Okay, resilience. So I don't want this to go into like a long programmatic debate around, you know, what does resilience mean? You know, what is resilience not? You know, I remember when the word resilience first came out, it meant everything and it meant nothing because it was so broad. But perhaps that's the reason why it's so important, because it can capture a lot of different things, but it's an important concept. This is like such a busy slide, I know, but I'm not going to confuse you. Basically, the only thing that I would like to take out from this slide is the fact that we all live in a food system, right? And so within this food system, you have different drivers of, so different entry points that make up a food system. So you've got the environmental, you've got technology and infrastructure, politics, economics, sociocultural dimensions, demographic, right? And this whole thing is what makes the food environment. And looking at this bit here, you know, we can see immediately that you can't address a food systems issue only by looking at, say, for instance, producing more food. Because you need to also address issues around how to store it, how to make it available throughout the year, how to give access to markets for people who produce that food so that they can profit from it and earn money. Then how do you process the commodity? How do you package it? And then lastly, how do you distribute it? And how does it actually form and enter the retail sector so that this food supply chain is really working as a chain. Only focusing on one of these chains is not going to be sufficient. In order to do all of that, you need to think about promotion, advertising, information, all of these things. So this is basically trying to tell you that there are so many different components to strengthening a food system. And strengthening a food system is what is going to allow all the different factors to converge, including what WFP brings to the table, to allow us to actually to meet some of these outcomes that we see here, a little bit hidden, but to attain the nutrition and health outcomes, to ensure quantity, quality, diversity, and safety of the food that people eat. The social, economic, and environmental impacts that the food system has or doesn't have. And last but not least, influencing consumer behavior, educating people and teaching them why something is important, but not just leaving it there, actually helping them understand that exclusive breastfeeding is not just a nice thing to do. It's important to do it for 1, 2, 3 reasons, and to actually help them change their behavior, just as an example. This is another very busy slide that talks a little bit about homegrown school feeding, because this homegrown school feeding is also a program that brings together, like the food systems, a multi-sectoral approach through one program that WFP provides, namely to address food insecurity, but by giving it to vulnerable kids who would normally be kept at home and not sent to school because the parents cannot afford to send the kid to school, or the parents need, the kids need to do work in order to, to contribute to the survival of the family. With the promise of 1 to 2 meals, that kid gets sent to school, especially girls who in some countries don't have that access to education. By allowing that family to say, okay, my girls are going to get fed, so I don't have to feed them, send them to school, that already gives them access to education that they would otherwise not have had. So this school feeding program is having all of those impacts. But then when you go to the school and you are using that program, not only to kind of educate and address health and nutrition issues, but you're now working with the smallholder farmers in that community to say, you guys can grow the potatoes and the cabbage and the beans that the program in your schools, in these schools, in your community are feeding your kids. So let's work on how we can use your products as the food that gets transformed into meals that feed your kids in this school feeding program, so that you can also benefit from it. So it gives back to the local economy. Now, by working with the Ministry of Education and the governments in the country, and helping them maybe use the school feeding program as one of their social welfare programs, and saying, okay, we'll set this up. After a few years, we do it together, and then after a few years of that, we're going to hand it over to you. So we're not going to get South Korea to fund this in Lesotho, but after a while, okay, Lesotho is a bad example because they're already funding it, but in a country where they're not funding it, they're getting assistance from another country, you would be saying, after a few years, you guys come up with a national budget, you take over the program, you fund it, and then you implement it. Then it becomes a national safety net program. That is the way a program like WFP's homegrown school feeding can bring a lot of different players in to have multiple outcomes or objectives, and really looks at different kind of value chains and opportunities. And not all of it has WFP's, WFP does not have a role in all of it, but WFP, by virtue of having this program, can be the enabler. We can actually be the agency that says, in order to, we need to work with the civil society in order to help change behavior of this community, or we need experts in agriculture and trade to come in and help us set up markets or systems, or educate the communities and the farmers on how to price and how to sell, and etc. And throughout all of this, the most important thing is the private sector, because we cannot sort this problem out without the private sector. It cannot just be governments. It has to be the private sector. This is just another example of this very same program that I just mentioned to you about. So I'll just skip that. I'm running a little bit short on time, so let me whiz through this. And this is where I want to talk to you a little bit about innovation. What does innovation mean for WFP? Well, we've got an innovation accelerator in Munich, Germany. We've had it for almost 10 years. It's won like a lot of prizes. It allows different stakeholders, and it can be individuals, it can be companies, it can be UN agencies, it can be universities, to come up with bold ideas that can be tested as solutions for addressing world hunger. Okay, so we give you the problem, world hunger, and you use innovative approaches to come up with bold ideas that then I'm simplifying this a lot, but then we develop and we incubate and we kind of develop into projects, and then we try them out. And for this, there's different ways of getting funding for it. But innovation in WFP is not something that we do when we have time. Innovation is something we have to do because we work in contexts where problems don't have a solution, and we are the solution. So we have to find the solution. We have to go from A to B. Okay, there's no airplanes. Okay, we'll operate an airline. We don't have this area doesn't have road. Okay, we'll build the roads. I'm simplifying a little bit. So innovation is something that is in the genetics of WFP. So through this innovation hub in Munich, last year, we've already had impact in 9 million people's lives. And this is through innovative projects that have been tried and tested, and they can be very cutting edge technological kind of driven projects. But sometimes innovation can be about just doing something a little bit differently. Yeah, it doesn't have to be groundbreaking. So just to give you an idea of how mainstreamed innovative approaches are in WFP, this is where we have different innovation projects being implemented around the world. I mean, you can see the dots are, everywhere, and they're in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Central America, etc. And you can, for those of you who are interested, because we do have innovation challenges and things like that, you should go in and Google, WFP Innovation Accelerator. But we have different types of programs. We have, ideas that try to kind of use things like artificial intelligence and blockchain and robotics, biometrics, all of these very specific technologies, and trying to see how we can make what we do in the countries where we operate a little bit more effective or efficient. Yeah. But then we also do innovation sourcing. So we use this accelerator to ask those experts out there whose job is to be innovative to say, what ideas might you have, right? Then we bring all of this together, and then we run these innovation boot camps, where for 5 days, these are highly intensive workshops just to develop, to get teams together to come up with some ideas. And then the best ideas get turned into what we call sprint programs that gets funded. And for 6 months, we get to try it out. So before I came to Korea, there was this idea of using electric pressure cooker, not a new technology, but how can we use commercial size electric pressure cooker in schools where we're doing school feeding, so that we not only reduce the amount of time it takes to cook, it uses energy that is not going to be harmful to the environment. It provides cleaner food and a more nutritious cooking methodology, so it's better for the kids. It stops the women who are typically the cooks to be breathing in lots and lots of smoke, so it's also helping them. You know, like lots of different kind of hypotheses. And that project got the $100,000, and they were just rolling it out for 6 months trial before I arrived, before I left, just as I left. So the WFP programs that we are actually doing also serve as a platform to test these innovative ideas. And I think for me, that is the most interesting offering that WFP has, because we have, we work in 123 countries. You can't get a bigger lab than that to test out your different theories. So very quickly, these are some of the kind of, and as I mentioned, it's not always technical. It's sometimes just different ways of doing it. Farm to Market Alliance. Sometimes the issue with food insecurity is that people produce, but they don't know where to sell it, right? So we created this alliance where it's farmers, it's wholesale buyers, it's the government, it's the processors, you know, and we formed an alliance and we said, okay, in this area, you guys, you know, help each other. So I'm you know, simplifying a little bit. So this alliance was, you know, also had fertilizer companies in there, and agriculture experts, you know, extension workers, like, you know, and so these kinds of coalitions sounds very, it sounds like common sense, but you'd be surprised at how sometimes it's not that easy to do. And so by actually structuring it and saying, okay, this is what we need to do, that in itself can have a huge impact. And this actually has had a massive impact. H2 grow, hydroponics, growing plant without soil, using very limited water, very important in countries that are deserts, and they don't have enough water to begin with. You know, this can change the lives of so many people, and it can turn you know, families who do not have access to green vegetables or, you know, fresh produce to now have that. And through training and things like that, it is not a difficult project to do, but one that can have a huge impact. We spoke a little bit about production being good, but then what do you do with all that extra, you know, fruit or vegetable, because they don't have fridges. You know, yes, they have some drying and preservation methodologies, but these are all ways to make the food last longer, right? In our country, we had kimchi that was, like, you know, buried in the ground, and we have the fermentation that is part of preservation. In addition to that, how can we help families who produce corn, who without some kind of help would lose 40% of it? So how can we help them not lose 40%? So by doing just that, they would already have more. And then you have to deal with, you know, the access to markets. And part of that post-harvest loss, it can be a simple thing. It's a big stack, yeah, that is made out of a particular material that stops the food, the grain, from getting infected by, you know, by pests, by insects. It's very simple solutions like that can have a huge impact. I'm just going to skip through these. I want to mention one thing about this collaboration that WFP is doing in West Africa, and it's based on South Korea's Tongil rice. RDA, the Rural Development Agency, created in Senegal this rice variety based on our Tongil rice called IGEE 7. And this rice grows, you know, 15 times faster than what's the local Sahelian rice variety, and it grows and it has a bigger yield. So not only is it quicker, it produces more. So we're trying this out through some of our programs to see, you know, how it goes. But these are some of the things that I think are really great, have great potential to be transformative. And these are solutions coming out of our country here in Republic of Korea. And also on the subject of rice, another area that I know that we, WFP and the Republic of Korea are very interested in looking at is kind of fortification. How can we make the rice kernels more minerally, fortified, with micronutrients? Because micronutrient deficiency, so the deficiency of certain vitamins and minerals in our body, is a huge form of malnutrition in the world. So malnutrition is not just about not having enough calories or not having enough protein or not having enough fat, but it's also about the quality of the micronutrients available in the body, because without certain vitamins, you can have as much calories or good calories as you want, but it's not going to absorb, it's not going to help. So subject of fortification is also an area that, innovatively speaking, WFP is looking at actively. In 1961, we were probably the poorest country in the world. We were poorer than North Korea. Look at Zimbabwe, DR Congo. We were poorer than DR Congo. Can you imagine this? This is a copy of a letter that the Minister of Agriculture, what year was this? In 1963, sent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, asking for WFP's relief assistance here in this country. So some of the programs that I was talking to you about, asset creation activities, that was what we were requested to do in this country, which we started in 1964. And we finished whatever we were doing in 1984. So during that period, WFP actually, here we are. This is doesn't exist anymore, this UN agency. So in terms of like formal UN agencies, WFP actually has had the biggest volume of assistance here in South Korea. And so I mention this not only because I'm WFP and I'm very proud of that legacy and the role that we played in elevating South Korea, Republic of Korea, from being the poorest country in the world to now being, one of the richest countries in the world. And as a South Korean, I feel very proud of that, right? I'm South Korean, and I'm also with WFP. So since since 64 to 84, we had 23 different projects, and these are not just food assistance projects. The Jeju, Sunandoro, we did infrastructure projects. We were, some of these project sites, you will recognize them today. We did 23 projects with over $104 million, and and this made a considerable difference. People remember us. My father's generation remembers us, and this is something very gratifying because this is what they remember. But look at this. This is someone in, I cannot remember, Eritrea, sorry, she's Eritrean, receiving rice from the Republic of Korea. So, it's in one lifetime. It's remarkable. And I think that this is a story, this is a history that every single Korean person should know. Should know, should remember, even if you have never had to feel hunger, this is your heritage. This is what, you know, where we came from. And I think it's a story that is worth telling, because it is not something that is, you know, to be shameful about. This is something that shows the world what South Korea was able to do and what we can offer others to do. So this is a slide that is basically projecting one of the ways in which WFP would like to showcase Republic of Korea's ability to end hunger. And the Semal Undong is a paradigm, it's a framework and an approach that WFP has been using in a lot of its resilience programs around the world to promote the same self-sufficiency and community-led development that Republic of Korea is so famous for today. And with that, I will end my presentation with once again the quote that reminds us that food is the pathway to peace. Thank you very much. I probably went quite over time, but I would be very happy to answer any questions from any of you in the room or online. If you could just raise your hand, or if you just have something you'd like to share, an observation, that would also be very welcome. Yes?
I'm speaking from quite a distance, so you might not be able to hear me quite clearly. I was quite glad to find South Korea's case as a successful scenario where humanitarian assistance can actually come with some sort of fruition in its efforts to help countries advance and achieve economic development. But also, I'm an economics major. I also recognise that the government is at the end of an ultimate pathway to any development or changes. And although humanitarian assistance does achieve remarkable things, and I do not want to undermine any of the efforts at all, but there would be some cases, countries, where governments are so corrupted and the social instability, like Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine, or many countries in Saudi Arabia, and also in the Middle East, their social instability simply prevents them, at least for the time being, where humanitarian assistance, its impact is limited to a short transient period. So I was wondering what WFP might do to such countries where political corruption just prevents WFP from achieving further progress, because you've mentioned that for realistic reasons the organisation cannot simply permanently and forever support countries, and a carefully constructed solution must be handed over to the government for them to do. It needs to be a public work. But what if governments refuse to do so, or what if the situation there, the political situation is not so ideal to be handed over the solution? How does the organisation respond to it?
Yeah, I knew I was going to get lots of difficult questions if there were questions. No, I'm just joking. It's an excellent question, though, because not always is it conducive or possible to do that. I'll give you an example. In Yemen, where there wasn't a government to hand over to, in Afghanistan, where the government was toppled over and the Talibans were in power, and until a few, until that, up until that point, the Taliban were, was considered a terror group, so how do you, so there's lots of situations where you are absolutely right. The conditions are not there on the ground to have that longer term conversation. But remember, I also mentioned that in some contexts, WFP and other actors like WFP have to provide and have to implement the programs that ideally should be done by the government or, eventually taken over by the government. But the reality is in those countries, we have to save these lives. So we have to do the distribution, we have to do the procurement, we have to do the fundraising, we have to do the transportation, we do the monitoring, we feed the people ourselves. And the government isn't there. And that's unfortunate, but that's the condition. Who is there, however, is the community, right? And so we work, so this community-based approach is very important because, engaging the community and providing support and assistance to help them is also a big step in the right direction. So it's not just, okay, obviously if it's a refugee camp setting, it's going to be very different to a context where you're in a village or in a community where people are still in their homes and they still have access to places and they can still move around. In a refugee camp context, it's going to be very different. But nevertheless, working with the leaders, the community or the camp leaders, regularly ensuring that you're getting feedback from the beneficiaries so that they also have a role, that they also understand and can contribute in both the design and the implementation of the programs and the assistance. I think these are all things that can not replace, but can also help in such situations. And then WFP is not a peace broker. I mean, our job is not to get involved in politics or to, but corruption and those things are a reality. And that's why we have a very, very strict accountability system. That's why we are known to be the monitoring agency. We monitor all the time. We have a huge data and analysis capacity in WFP. It's called vulnerability and analysis and vulnerability assessment and mapping, VAM. Because food security requires constant, data collection and constant monitoring. So by doing that, you're also having access to other things, like taxation or protection issues. So we do have leverage on a lot of different areas, but I do think that there are, in the absence of those ideal situations, I think that there are still some ways where we can make sure that we are not just doing what we think we should do, but doing it in a way that can also foster some kind of ownership and accountability as well.
Vulnerability assessments actually show what is its range of social vulnerability or domestic? Does it cover also domestic violence? Because it may also relate to food insecurity issues in really poor developed countries, marginalized geographical areas where women do not simply have business opportunities. Often I've learned from my class that microloan program will often provide us with in order to help them self-finance and grow their own entrepreneurship. But so what kind of consensus does it make for vulnerability assessment?
Yeah, when it comes to WFP, vulnerability is always about food insecurity. So we will be measuring people's vulnerability to food security, not necessarily their vulnerability to gender-based violence or corruption or equal access to education. Those are not the indicators that we would be collecting, but we would be collecting things like their food consumption score or diet diversity, or so things like how regularly do you eat, how regularly do you eat that's, animal protein, or, those kinds of really food security related. But while we do that, we can also monitor things like, how much of your assets were destroyed by the typhoon, or when there was flooding, how did that? So we can do some peripheral data collection, but when it comes to vulnerability, WFP is not an expert when it comes to corruption or anything like that. I mean, so we need to focus on collecting data that is related to food insecurity. But you're right that there is a lot of other, obviously, connections. And so you can use WFP's food assistance program to collect complaints, to set up a complaints and feedback mechanism that is set up so that if I'm supposed to receive a food assistance, but WFP team on the ground didn't tell me the distribution schedule, so I missed it, then I can call this hotline or this feedback mechanism and report those kinds of things. But by virtue of having that hotline, you can also allow my neighbor who doesn't have the same issues, but maybe suffers from gender-based violence, or is being abused by her husband or whatever, can also use that platform to report those things. So you kind of like have these opportunities to layer different things. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Director Yoon. Can you hear my voice clearly?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions exactly. First, if the COVID pandemic is prolonged, and might be there's another conflict that will going on, what is the worst situation that we could expect it in the future? And in this case, I also want to know what South Korea would face, because as we know, South Korea is quite dependent to the supply chain, and countries like Singapore, even though we're not like a Singapore, is quite affected by the global supply chains right now. And the second, I'm really interested with the customer behavior program in the chart before. Is it also could be an alternative if there is a supply chain damage, for example, in one alternative of food that we can changing the, what do you call it, as a dietary behavior of one places to changing to another alternative of sources. For example, if you don't have the wheat, maybe we can go for a rice, for example. So instead of like lacking on one of the dietary supply, we're looking for alternative. Is it what it means of consumer behavior, or is it something else? Thank you very much. I hope it's clear enough.
It is very clear, Pedra. Your first question about the impact, what's the worst that can happen if the current trends continue?
Sure.
I can't answer that because we don't know, but we know that it's already bad, right? It's already bad now, and you can only imagine what kind of catastrophe anything worse is going to lead to, over and above the numbers increasing. So it's not 350 million who are food insecure. It's going to be a lot more than that. But for sure, if left unattended, there will be more people facing famine. There will be more social unrest in different countries. And there will be continued major price hikes and supply shortages that we already see now. So how bad will it get? I don't know. But if you look at the past 4 months, it's incredible what has happened in 4 months. And that was, just as the world was trying to recover from 2 years of the pandemic. What can happen in the next 4 to 6 months? Your guess is as good as mine, Pedro, but but it's very worrying because it could be really catastrophic, and no country would be immune to it. You can already see on the supply chain side, this market is affecting us too here, and not just because it's creating, at the end of the day, even if Russia and Ukraine's supplies in wheat and maize have been curtailed, when you look at the, net, the world has enough, but it's about where and how accessible. And so this is obviously going to affect South Korea, the Republic of Korea, that imports also wheat and other commodities. So that's just straight, supply issue. But then you got to remember that Korea is also an export country, right? So if you've got an abnormal supply chain market, which is the case and has been for a couple of years now already, that's going to have a large knock-on effect on the economy. So this is over and above the inflation rates that we're seeing and all the different steps that are being taken now or considered by the government. Your second question around the issue of if one commodity is no longer as available as it used to be, switching to an alternative commodity, is that, or could that be considered some kind of a consumer behavioral change? If I understood you correctly, Pedro? Yeah. So when we talk about social behavioral change in WFP, we talk about that mostly in the area of nutrition, where you are trying to not just tell someone why they should do 1, 2, 3, but actually influence that person or that community's behavior, which could be deeply rooted in culture, right? So, for instance, in Bangladesh, based on a true story, the culture, and I think it's similar in our country, the culture was that you feed white rice porridge to babies. But white rice porridge is not that nutritious, right? So it's just a very simple example. So then how do you educate? And then even if you tell them, okay, this is not as nutritious as that doesn't mean that they're going to, the community is going to listen to you. So how do you change behavior? And behavior is about culture. It's about emotions. It's about what you learned from your mom and what she learned from her mom or your dad. And it's about mindset, right? So there's social behavioral change is probably one of the hardest things to do, and no textbook solution. But if wheat is no longer available, so for instance, if I'm in a country that has over the years become the staple food has become rice. Okay, so this is the case in many African countries. But suddenly rice becomes goes in short supply, or it turns out that the production of rice in the quantities that country needs would be harmful to the environment. Then it would be a case of, yes, working with a lot of different partners to introduce the idea of diversification of commodities. It's not an easy thing, but Fedra, I think that would be more than just a consumer kind of behavior change. I think that would be a completely different, at a much bigger level, an initiative that would have to be undertaken to diversify.
Thank you very much, Director Yun.
Thank you, Fedra. Okay, Ho-jung Chun, sorry.
Do you think it's
Okay.
And his question was that how are you planning to implement the humanitarian development and peace nexus into WFP projects and programs?
Thank you so much for that question, because it's a question that we don't actually ask ourselves enough, in my opinion. So, I talked about the humanitarian mandate, and then the development mandate, and the fact that we work in countries where there's conflict, and conflict is the number one driver between, when it comes to hunger. So it only goes without saying that humanitarian development and the peace component are things that are just affecting what WFP does across the board. So how are we doing? How do we actually work in this nexus or across this nexus? The simple answer is resilience. That's the simple answer. But it's so not simple to do resilience. It takes a long time. It takes multi-year commitment of funding. It takes different sectors to work together across different kind of value chains. And it requires the expertise of multiple stakeholders. So in WFP, when we talk about resilience, it goes into, let me give you examples of what our resilience program is. It is the school feeding program that I mentioned. We have also our asset creation activities that are typically what we would define resilience programming to be. So asset creation is, for instance, working with a community in a very degraded environment to rehabilitate their surroundings, so the area where they live, so that it mitigates things like floods or heavy rains or snow or whatever. But it also tackles things like soil erosion, so planting trees, doing these, applying different technologies to kind of plant more things basically around the area. By doing that, maybe not just planting any tree, but planting fruit trees that can then produce fruits too. So it not only holds the land, the soil together, it then provides fruits, which can also be nutritious intake of food or sold. And then you have the trees that are planted can also serve as a way of providing a safe source of fuel for that community, so that it allows women not to go travel out far to search for firewood and expose themselves to risk of gender-based violence, for instance. So our resilience program and our asset creation activity can do any and all of those asset creations, whether it is digging drains so that the rainwater goes, the rain drains, or doing things like planting or land, watershed management so that you are healing the earth basically, or planting things in a way that can actually give back to the community, or building, like a water dam, irrigation structure, so that the whole village or the whole community can have access to water, all year round. So by doing that in contexts that are both fragile and suffering from conflict and instability, that is probably the easiest way for me to explain in a nutshell how WFP's resilience program can encapsulate our work in the HDP nexus. So I think with that, I think we could end the session. I really want to thank you very much for the very thought-provoking questions, very tough questions, and for this opportunity to really share with you some of my insights from WFP. Thank you very much.
Before we wrap up the seminar, one more question. Could you give the audience one sentence take-home message to keep in mind, please? It's a kind of gift present.
One thing that you can take home. I think my one you know, this is a room full of very smart, young future leaders. I think the message I would give you, if there was one message I could give you, is that hunger is not just someone else's problem. These are not someone else's problems. These are our shared responsibilities as citizens, global citizens. And you heard, we're not the Republic of Korea we were in 1961. We have a different role, and I think you all have a huge role to play in that. So that would be my multiple single message. Thank you very much.
I'm so happy to have you for today's seminar. This is the end of today's seminar, but at the same time, I hope this is a great step for further collaboration between WFP and Yonsei University. Okay. And I thank all the participants again for being with us today. I hope to see you again in the next G4 or in the fall. Until then, please stay healthy and happy. Thank you very much.